Welcome to ACI Learning's summer webcast series. I'm your host, Kathy Chambers. Today, our presenter, Dr. Hernan Murdock, will be presenting on the 8 E's of Operational Audit Excellence. Dr. Murdock is a certified internal auditor, an instructor for several of our audit, risk, and fraud courses, and he's also the Vice President of Content and Programming at ACI Learning. ACI Learning trains leaders in cybersecurity, audit, and information technology, delivering lifetime learning to over 250,000 engaged students, professionals, and organizations across 6 continents. Now, many of you attending today may know or have heard of the MIST Training Institute, or MISTI. MISTI has been training auditors, risk and compliance, fraud, and information security professionals worldwide for over 40 years. MISTI is now a part of and is being rebranded as ACI Learning. Check us out at acilearning.com and follow us on your favorite social media. We encourage you to submit questions as we go along. Please put your questions in the question panel and go to webinar on the right side of your screen. This webcast is being recorded and a link to the recording will be sent to you within a week. All right, Dr. Hernan, let's get started with today's topic, the 8 E's of Operational Audit Excellence. Hello, Dr. Hernan.
Hello, nice to be here with you.
Oh, it's so good to see you again. This is part 2 of our four-part series is what I'm trying to say.
Indeed it is, yes. So we have a selection of different topics to cover, and I'm glad to be here again speaking about this very important topic.
All right, so what are we going to learn today?
So today we're talking about the 8 E's, and it's a very helpful framework and tool that can be used when we're looking at operational reviews and how we can help organize our thoughts around it and the methodology we're going to follow. But before we get into what those 8 E's are, let's talk a bit about the goals of operational audits and how 8E fits into that. So when we think about operational reviews, a very important thing here is about meeting objectives. What is it that unit, division, program, process, activity is all about? What do they do? And a big part of that is how do we make sure the auditors are aligned with those operational and business goals? So we want to make sure that we think of ourselves as internal auditors as helping support the organization and their objectives. This is going to help with that. Another important thing with the 8 E's is that it helps us to support the idea with this central to operational reviews of faster, cheaper, better. When we think about the world around us, that really drives a lot of what's happening everywhere, whether it's the United States, abroad, developing countries, whether it's small organizations, large organizations, for-profit, nonprofit. I can keep dissecting the economy in many different ways. At the end of the day, just about everyone everywhere is driving towards these 3 words, faster, cheaper, better. And when we use that as a driving force for our reviews, we start to find that we can benefit from some kind of a framework that helps organize our work along those key stakeholder imperatives as well.
Dr. Hernan, do you
Yes.
think that now that we are in this pandemic era that faster, better, cheaper is even more on their minds now?
Absolutely. Yes. What that did, the pandemic, is that it brought to light a lot of things that in some cases perhaps were, let's call it, hidden by economic growth, right? As the economy is growing, money's coming in and things are happening. And as you're getting more customers, you're generating more revenue, in some cases you can kind of, not that we encourage this, of course, but in many cases what happens is as you go about doing your things just kind of get hidden. They don't become as visible. When we experience economic hardship, then we start to see the problems in the processes. We start to see where the different elements of what we do may not be optimal. And that's one of the things that COVID did, is that it highlighted some of the weaknesses in our programs and processes. So that is definitely, let's call it a benefit, in that this really brought to light the importance of operational reviews and how faster, cheaper, better is something that we cannot ignore. So yes, it did bring it back to light. Another important thing is this idea of being successful and sustainable. So we have been dealing with this dynamic in our economies for a very long time, where we have this very interesting and perhaps overwhelming focus on short-term results. And part of what we need to help the organizations do is, yes, mind the short term, but at the same time, keep a lookout for the medium and the longer term. So success is measured in different dimensions, and it is also measured in terms of time, short, medium, and long term. So once again, operational reviews are designed to help the organization keep an eye on these things And the 8 E's framework can help us make sure we accomplish that as we go about doing our reviews.
So Dr. Hernan, let's talk about the 80s real quick before you get into it. So, you know what, you and I have spoke about this before. It started off as the 3 E's, and over the years, through your experiences, you added another 5.
That's right. Exactly. Yes, I've been an auditor for decades. And as I started out in this business, you get trained on what operational reviews are all about, and you start with those underlying principles. And I know that many of our viewers and a lot of practitioners are still operating under those 3 primary E's. I refer to them as primary E's. They're the foundation for operational reviews. So let's take a look at those. So going one at a time, the first one is economy. That has to do with the price we pay for our inputs. When we talk about inputs can be a variety of different things. For some organizations, it might be raw materials. It could be semi-finished goods. It could be assemblies or sub-assemblies. It could also be money. How much are you paying to get money? Let's say you float bonds. How much are you paying for those in interest and all of the other fees that you have to pay to get the capital you need to do your work? You may be paying labor costs. You may be paying for utilities. You may be paying rent. A lot of different inputs into the organization as it goes about doing its work. So when we think about economy, the overarching concept here is asking ourselves, are we paying what things are worth? It is not only about price. I want to make sure that's clear as well. Sometimes people think about buying things at the lowest cost or lowest price. And yes, that's a good starting point. However, you could find yourself buying things that are literally cheap in the sense that it's not only low price, but also low quality. So we need to think value. Are you getting what things are worth? So we don't want to overpay. This is one of the overarching principles of running a successful organization, paying the right price for things and all of the other service and value elements that go with it. Service elements, warranties, delivery timeline, quality, of course, like I mentioned previously, responsiveness by the vendor, all of these, that flexibility, even in many cases, becomes very important. So economy, paying what things are worth. That's a very important starting point as we talk about these 8 E's, and one of those 3 that you were highlighting just a moment ago.
So Dr. Hernan, one thing I didn't hear you mention, and I'm not sure if it's part of this category, is also businesses and organizations need to consider how much money they borrow, correct? To make sure that they can actually pay that money back in the long run.
Absolutely, yes. And what could happen, and now in general, we, especially in the United States and developed economies, we're dealing with very low interest rates by and large. So in that sense, that is not as pressing right now, but things change. And that's one of the things to keep in mind as well. Whether you have fixed rate loans or variable rate loans, what are they pegged on, and how frequently do they adjust? And even if they don't change substantially in that nominal sense, but as you think about the maturity of those, right? How long are those bonds for? You may find yourself, as conditions may change in the future, are you then obligated to pay a very high interest rate as those interest rates change? That could happen. And also remember that the nominal rate is one thing, but how much are you borrowing? So it is calculated based on that principle. So from that perspective, then we also need to think about whether or not we can afford to pay the interest and the principal so we can retire that loan or those debt obligations when the time comes. So absolutely, yes, interest rates matter quite a bit. So let's take a look at the next E in our sequence. So we spoke about economy. The second one, and this is one of the primary 3s, is efficiency. This one has to do with the use of those inputs. So economy refers to the price and the value around the inputs that the organization gets. Now, efficiency is at what rate are you using those inputs to produce whatever it is your organization produces. Some organizations are manufacturing, so they're making maybe tires, they're making brakes, they're making furniture, they could be making whole automobiles, building houses, a lot of different things that companies can make in the manufacturing segment. But you can also look in terms of organizations that are perhaps in a service environment, and their production is around a service. How efficient are the people as they do their work? How efficient are the machines as they're used by the people? How efficient are the technological platforms, the computer systems that the people use? So efficiency is the use of those inputs, and how well and how effectively are we using them to maximize the outputs that we produce. In some organizations, they are great at it, and there's very little waste. Waste can be just the raw materials. I can kind of providing examples from manufacturing where you may have scrap and other waste that is produced along the way, but you can also have from the work that people do where they're not being fully utilized. There's a lot of wait time. Wait can apply to people. They don't have anything to do. They're waiting for something to come through so they can continue working. It could be equipment that is, again, sitting idle, not being used. Maybe you're paying for this equipment. So efficiency is the rate at which you use the inputs to produce your outputs. The third element is effectiveness. Effectiveness has to do with the achievement of goals. So goals can come in many different ways, like I explained earlier. So it can be financial, they could be operational, they could be in terms of achieving compliance. It can be about, for example, being environmentally responsible. You have the goals of that are classified in many different ways. But at the end of the day, effectiveness has to do with the rate at which we are achieving those goals. So are we achieving those at 100%, which means that you come in right where you need to be? Are you above those? 125%, 130%, right? Above the goal. Or it could be short. You could be coming in at 90, 80, 75 or less, right? Any number. So effectiveness has to do with the ability to achieve our stated goals. And very, very important, because when you think about for-profit organizations, there may be some financial metrics. The investors may be expecting certain goals to be achieved. Nonprofit organizations may have similar measures as well. It could be about, for example, helping refugees resettle. So effectiveness goals may be in terms of the numbers and percentage of people who are then serviced. It could be in terms of delivering packages. At what rate do we deliver those packages to the right address at the right address at the right time as promised, and so on, and without damage. So effectiveness has to do with a lot of those metrics. So effectiveness is about the rate at which we're achieving our goals, and these are the top three.
Dr. Hernan, as an auditor, as you're looking at some of these processes of an organization and seeing which departments are effective, which departments aren't effective, what's your advice to leaders if they're just not hitting any of their goals in multiple departments?
Great question, because there could be a number of different variables at play. So what could happen is that the goals were set poorly. Let's take that as the first possibility, that they were poorly constructed. Maybe they were unachievable. People sometimes refer to the SMART goals, S-M-A-R-T, specific, measurable, achievable, reviewed, and time-bound. Very great acronym to help define the goals and make sure that we have the key elements built into them for organizations. So that could be one of the scenarios. The other one could be that you did a great job in terms of conceptualizing what they are, but not in terms of communicating what the methodology is to achieve it. Another scenario is that you designed it well, you communicated what you expected, but they don't have the resources to do what they need to do. Another one could be distraction, where yes, you conceptualized it, yes, you had all the metrics and you communicated it, yes, you gave them the resources, but you were not following up on it and monitoring progress. Or there were conflicting goals and people were scattered, if you will, in terms of doing this for a while, doing that for a while, doing that for a while. So they're moving back and forth and they're not really focusing on what they need to. So all of these scenarios have played out. And over the years, having done a lot of audit and consulting engagements, I've seen a variety of those kind of dynamics play out. So that's a great question, because in many organizations, you have one or several of those scenarios that I just gave you as what's happening and why they're not achieving their goals. So moving to the next E is equity. And quite often what happens is that people readily move towards the idea of, because equity refers to fairness, right? And respectful treatment and so on. So many people gravitate towards compliance when it comes to equity, and that's understandable. And what I mean by that is in terms of fair employment, promoting the right person in terms of merit, in terms of being transparent with your employees, transparent with your customers, transparent with your vendors. So fairness in all of our dealings. So compliance makes sense. There are rules, regulations, contracts, and various things like those to help push us towards equity. I agree with that. That's a great starting point. However, there are a number of less evident elements around equity that we also need to pay attention to. So I'll give you an example. Imagine an environment, an organization where we're looking at filling a vacancy, and we have a gentleman who is a great person, great personality. People like him very much. He maybe barbecues and takes people to his house, maybe has a boat, and everybody loves this guy, but he's not very effective in work. He's not a very good fit for the position as a manager or whatever it may be. So likability wise, that is the person that they're looking at. Then we have, let's say, a woman, just using that as an example. She's very qualified, very knowledgeable. She has a track record, dedication, smart, focus. She delivers. She has what it takes to get the work done. So then as we look at this position needs to be filled, in some organizations, because of favoritism and nepotism and other cultural issues, let's say that the gentleman gets the job. He's not the best fit for it, and he may not contribute as he could or should to that position and the people who may be reporting to him. The young lady, who is the better qualified person, is skipped, and now we have a scenario to confront here, to deal with. Because of a fairness issue, lack of equity, this person got the job and not the right person. When other employees see it, that is going to impact morale, it may impact productivity, it may impact turnover. So we have to be very mindful about equity and not only think about from a compliance perspective. There are cultural elements around equity that if we're not careful about can really start contaminating the organization. And that's part of why I like this fourth E around equity, is making sure that as internal auditors, we start to also dig a little bit into some of those elements to make sure the organization is doing what's right and that they're focusing on fairness in all its dealings, because failure to do that can really have some negative effects on the organization.
Yeah, I like the equity E as well, because maybe it's not in the auditor scope of work per se, but it is something that auditors should start to incorporate into their programs.
Exactly. And that's part of why I like this 8Es model, because it starts to bring to the surface other dimensions of our scope of work and where we can contribute to the success of the organization. Because imagine now, going back to this example I just gave you, if we have this happening on a recurring basis, this becomes the normal way things happen. The politics override merit. That eventually is going to contaminate the organization culture. You are eventually going to have some serious problems. So auditors should look at this. I think of it as a risk, becomes then part of our mandate as well to take a look at it as best we can. So equity, the number 4 E associated with this model. Let's look at the next one. So environment. So this relates to ecology. And one of the challenges that we sometimes have is that we think of it from a very altruistic way. It's the right thing to do. Organizations should be more responsible and better stewards of the environment. We agree with that by and large. I agree with that. I believe it's definitely the way it should be. And I say should be deliberately, because in many cases what happens is the economic element really supersedes that altruistic dimension that we may try to pursue. Organizations, the for-profit ones in particular, by and large are looking at how it impacts the bottom line. So I believe that we need to think about the environment in that dual mode. Part of it is that it's the right thing to do for the environment and the local communities and everything, the water, the land, the air, and everything else. We can also think of it from that economic perspective. Are we generating too much waste? How do we get rid of the waste? How are we able to use that environmental mindset and focus to package things better? So let me elaborate on this as an example. Imagine an organization that is manufacturing, once again, or it could be shipping organization, applies to both. So you have an organization that's producing something, needs to put it in packages and ship it somewhere. How you package matters quite a bit. So you may be thinking in terms of the amount of packaging material to protect the content from damage and so on in transit. If you use too much, yes, you get to a point where you're protecting the content and then you're way above what will reasonably be necessary. The extra packaging brings some cost. The extra packaging creates some bulk. The extra packaging may create even some weight. Now you're talking about how many more containers, how many more crates, how many more shipments, how many more drivers, how much more waste is generated when it gets to destination and now they open it and then they don't need the packaging anymore. So the environmental element is important to consider because of that we are all in this planet together, but there's an economic element as well that we can also contemplate and say, if we're really mindful of the ecological impact of what we do, we will produce less weight, it will produce less waste, it may even save us labor costs and shipping costs and a lot of other costs that are generating by not keeping a close eye to it. Another example I'll give you has to do with heating and cooling. Some organizations are great at it in terms of making sure buildings are properly insulated and they're using great technologies to manage their temperatures. Others are not. So you're wasting money. So the environment matters altruistically and economically. And that's part of why I like this other element here. So now we're looking at this fifth E. And I think that as an operational auditor, you can also take a look at that to see whether or not we're really within what is reasonable and how we can put our best foot forward for our stakeholders.
Well, you talked about from an economic perspective, but what about from a risk perspective? And I'm thinking more along the lines of, I'm here in Florida, so I'm thinking more along the lines of climate change and how that's going to affect your business, maybe not this year, but the next year or the next year.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes. So there's an economic element around the environment in that you can also look, for example, at how much you have hardened your real estate. If you are in, just to build on what you said in terms of, for example, areas that are close to the ocean, you're thinking in terms of are our facilities and our people in a position where they could be negatively impacted by the ocean, whether it is just the tidal changes, whether it is storms, whether it is the heat, temperatures, lack of rain, or overabundance of it. So looking at the environmental elements can also help us in terms of where we position our assets, whether they are machinery, equipment, buildings, and so on, and the people who are going to do this work for us. Another thing to mention, just to bring IT into this conversation and working on your question around environment, imagine where you have your data center. I know a lot of organizations are putting a lot of things on the cloud, and that in many cases then becomes something for the cloud providers to make sure that their data centers are safe from environmental impact. But whatever you have, even your routers and your switches and your servers and various things like those, you may still have some equipment. Where is it? In many cases, organizations used to put in the cheapest real estate, which was in the basement. That is not a good place. Even the first floor is in some cases becoming a questionable place to have it. You need to elevate some of these things because in the case of flood, all of that is going to be damaged. So you have massive disruption. So yes, the environment is an important consideration about the physical location as well as how we produce what we produce. The placement of things matters quite a bit too. Looking at the next E is ethics. So very important and very central to what auditors do. That's overarching in many cases, but still, I think it's very important we have a discrete element around it. So ethics have to do with how we behave. And of course, behavior comes from the decisions, and the decisions come from the attitudes and awareness. So as operational reviewers, we can definitely contribute to the organization and help strengthen the ethical infrastructure of the organization. So are we screening people based on ethical and cultural fit? Are we onboarding them and training them? Do we have the right policies in place? Do we get the right training? And then in terms of how their attitudes reflect decisions, and then how they carry out their work, because then it becomes behavior, and repeated behavior becomes culture. So you can find yourself in a case where people don't care about quality, and we'll get into another E pretty soon. So be on the lookout for it. But you're thinking in terms of why is it that they're careless? Could be careless about the environment, careless about equity, careless about effectiveness. So part of that is an attitude. And some of that needs to be seen from the perspective of who we are and our sense of responsibility to our stakeholders. We have investors, we have lenders, we have the communities around us, we have taxpayers who are all expecting the organization to behave a certain way. If we have ethical breakdowns, chances are it'll spill over into one of the other E's.
What's an example of an ethical breakdown? I'm trying to think, maybe, and I know you're going to make fun of me for asking this because I ask it almost every time we have a topic, but is fraud under that kind of ethical breakdown?
I consider fraud a colossal breakdown of ethics. That's kind of how I simplified, and of course there's a much more technical definition and the dynamics and mechanics around fraud. But by and large, fraud is just a breakdown of ethics. So a deliberate action for inappropriate gain. And I say inappropriate gain because it could be for the individual, could be another individual, could be another organization, internal, external. There are so many different permutations to it. But absolutely. So think about, for example, someone who is looking at vendor selection, and the organization wants to make sure that it finds the best vendor to provide the right inputs at the right price, the right period of time, the right location, all of those parameters that we expect from a vendor. What if that individual steers business to a friend or an acquaintance or family member? Steering business to someone that is not the best qualified or suitable organization, a conflict of interest, and potentially also subjecting the organization to additional costs, poor quality, and other repercussions. So ethics rather, and the breakdown of our need to abide by those ethical principles could once again contaminate our program or our process because of the person's mindset and how their allegiance and their focus is other than what the organization is expecting of him or her. Let's move to the next one. So excellence. Excellence has to do with quality. So I like to also add this to the sequence of E's, right, as the 8 E's go, because one of the key things we need to look at from an operational audit perspective is the quality of the work that is being done. So by and large, and we can get more specific, of course, but by and large, are people thinking, making decisions, and acting in a way that is going to keep excellence as their ultimate goal? Are they doing the best they can? So if that is not the case, and they're taking shortcuts, and if they are basically following this idea of good enough, and I don't get paid for that, and I can't be bothered, and so on. So what you have now is a pervasive dynamic around not pursuing excellence, right? You have this idea of Kaizen, continuous improvement, which is one of the counter ways of looking at this, right? If Kaizen is part of what your organization's culture is about, then continuous pursuit of improvement and perfection. You may not be there, we're not perfect, but we're trying to get better. If that's the way we operate, fantastic. If that's not the case, and excellence is not a driving force, as an operational auditor, you should be careful, because this is going to eventually manifest itself. It could be small things, could be large things, could be isolated, but eventually it's probably going to become repetitive and it's probably going to become pervasive. So that's another reason why excellence is an important element to keep in mind, and why I think that as we are looking at how we plan our reviews and how we assess the areas we're reviewing and examining as auditors, that we should be looking to whether or not excellence is built in there. And you can see it manifested in the training, in the messaging that happens, even in the monitoring. What is it that the organization is monitoring? Let me give you an example. So you could be counting how much you produce, but you could be producing a lot and creating a lot of errors. So now what you have is that you're producing a lot of junk in a way, right? Things that need to be reprocessed, reworked, and fixed. So excellence will beg for producing as much as you reasonably can without having a significant problem with errors along the way. So excellence definitely is something that can permeate the organization, and something that our monitoring and what we choose to monitor can tell us quite a bit about.
I was just thinking about how traditionally auditors have been working on compliance and financial audits, and now we're doing more. And one of those things is operational audits. How can auditors excel or improve their work if it's something new to them?
So some of it is training. Some of that will be just making sure that they attend the sessions like this one that we're putting together, just to exchange some of these ideas and to share viewpoints on how we can go about doing things better and service our clients better. So compliance has been around for, well, really thousands of years. If we think about the financial reviews, we've been doing that for a very long time as well. So that's a very, let's call it a natural direction that a lot of auditors will look at and take. But we have seen over the last few decades that we look at accounting as important, but internal auditors are looking at different skill sets. It is going beyond the accounting. It is going beyond just following the rule book and just checking to see whether or not things are done according to a rule book, whether this is developed internally or externally or something like it. And we're getting into more operational reviews, which has to do with the how we do our work and why we do what we do. So from that perspective, we go beyond the what. We're talking about why and the how as being very, very important. And I don't want to minimize the when and the who either, because even that can also tell you quite a bit about where things can be improved upon. So absolutely, to your point in terms of what we have focused on in the past and how we can get the skills to do this better, these frameworks, and I like, and again, I expanded on this one myself over the years. Part of that is taking a broader look at the organization and thinking, okay, well, while we're doing this review, what else can we do that will add value and how we can contribute to the success of the organization, making the auditors support the efforts of the organization to succeed in different dimensions, not just the classical financial and compliance ones. Another important thing that I would like to highlight, and this is the eighth E, is emotion. Now, this maybe raise a little bit of your eyebrows, if you will. But the reason I added this and the reason I like this a lot is because emotion has to do with engagement. And the question then becomes, and this is one of the ways I like to think of it, do people identify with the organization's mission and vision? Because if they do, they will really have the predisposition to think about how we can contribute to achieving that, right? From within, they're thinking in terms of how I can support those because I have invested myself into the pursuit of this mission and vision. If that's not the case, though, then we have potentially a problem with engagement. Disengaged employees, and there are different levels of it. Once you look into it, you have engaged, partially engaged, and actively disengaged, and different classifications are along those lines. But engaged employees are going to go the extra mile. They're going to try to service the customer. And when I say customer, internal, external, customers in the classical sense, or even their colleagues, they're trying to be helpful. They're engaged. They'll go the extra mile. They'll research. They'll study. They'll try to find out. And to your question earlier about getting the skills, they'll want to get the skills. The ones who are not engaged are kind of there, they're apathetic. They'll do the minimal amount of work. They just don't want to get into too much trouble, so they just do the bare minimum, but they're really not in it. And there's a lack of enthusiasm to what they do. That's going to manifest in the volume, the quality, and the way they interact internally and externally with their stakeholders. Now, the actively disengaged are, in many cases, and I think of it as actually dangerous in some cases because they could actually sabotage what the mission and vision is all about. They could actually try to put sand or gravel or whatever you want to use to illustrate this into the gears of the organization. So they are something to also keep in mind. So emotion and engagement, very important as the eighth E, because that also speaks loudly to how well the organization is going to execute on a recurring basis by the people in the organization. So looking for pockets where they may be less than engaged, where there may be elements of disgruntled employees and people who may even engage in sabotage and other things that could be counter to the efforts to succeed. We need to be on the lookout for that as well.
Dr. Hernan, what are some of the benefits of an operational audit?
So the operational audit is designed to help the organization take a look at how it is designing its mission, vision, and its goals, how the structure is set up to support those mission, vision, and goals. The structure, is it conducive to success or not? Some organizations, and over the years, looking at some organizations, you see a lot of confusion, different reporting lines, and it just creates a lot of problems in execution. So mission, vision, goals, structure, and then how the work is done. And I like to go through the who, what, when, where, and how, of course. So looking at those elements about the execution itself. So it's all about adding value to the stakeholders. It is about making sure that we focus on what matters most. In some organizations, you may find that people are distracted. They're not focused enough. They may be using resources in less than optimal ways. They may be spending too much time addressing issues that are really not that important. You need to also have a sense about what is core to the organization and what is not. And understanding that helps a lot. So operational auditors can also help make sure the goals are well stated, the risk and controls are well aligned, and then the execution helps us achieve the 8 E's. Then another thing that I'd like to highlight is that this is also a framework that management can use. We've been talking a lot about the auditors. And again, we want to make sure the auditors have these tools at their disposal. But to the extent that we can help management also focus on these things, I think it'll serve everyone well. Our stakeholders expect a lot, they expect different things, but together, our stakeholders expect that we are going to deliver on these 8 E's. So I would like to encourage us to think of it that way as well.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Hernan. And for our viewers, if you have some questions, please just be sure to enter them now in the chat panel. That's there on the right side of your screen. But before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Audit Pro TV. Audit Pro TV is a subscription-based, on-demand audit training that's effective and engaging. A 1-year subscription costs less than a 3-day classroom course. You can always access the training when you need it, if you need it, wherever you are. Just visit acilearning.com to learn more about Audit Pro TV. So Dr. Hernan, I hear in-person classroom training is coming back this December.
That's right, Kathy, you're correct. We're really excited to announce that this December we are offering a week of in-person training classes in Orlando, Florida. That's right next to Disney World. So if you're eager to get back to live classroom training, this is the perfect opportunity to do that. Visit Disney and earn your CPE credits. We have everything from 2, 3, 4, and even 5-day audit courses to choose from, so there is something for everyone. So I hope people can come to it.
All right, that's great. I look forward to seeing everyone there. All right, let's get to some of our questions. The first question says, this all sounds familiar, Dr. Hernan, and that they link to the general concept of organizational success. Is that accurate?
Yes, so really what auditors are about is verifying that, and I like to use this expression as well, build right and run right. So success in many ways can be summarized from that perspective of, did we build the organization right? So that's where the structure element comes in, and the goals and objectives and all of those things come in. Did we build it right? Organization, program, processes, and so on, and then run right. So success is about those two things. And operational auditors, I believe, should take a look at those kinds of things, because less than optimal dynamics around those two dimensions are eventually going to spill over into execution and success, and how we achieve the expectations of our stakeholders. So yes, I believe that there's a close alignment between this and success.
Awesome. Emily writes, I work for a nonprofit. Can this model be used and adapted for nonprofits?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So when you think about the nonprofit world, so let's pick a few of these 8 E's, right? So as we're thinking about it, you think about, for example, economy. The nonprofit organizations, whether it's like an NGO, university, or a government agency, and so on, you're working with a budget that quite often is limited. You usually don't have enough money to do what you need to do. We go right back to mission, vision, right? So from that perspective, then economy is very important. You don't want to overpay for anything if you don't have to. You want to pay what they're worth. So economy, definitely very important. Let's talk, for example, about effectiveness. Quite often in the nonprofit world, we have very close eyes. It happens in the for-profit world, of course, as well. But where I'm just responding to the nonprofit question. Effectiveness is a very important question raised by donors. And if we have an NGO that is taking donations and requesting individuals and organizations to donate to their cause, they want to be able to achieve their goals. If you're working from taxpayer monies, like in government, you quite often also have the Inspector General, and you have taxpayers and special interest groups that are asking, how are you using these money? This is going back to the value for money concept, and that's one of the names sometimes you use for operational reviews. And I'll add one more that goes back to, for example, emotion. So are you bringing in people who believe in the mission? And this matters in the nonprofit world quite a bit, because in many cases, because of their limited resources, you can't pay what someone may be doing in the private sector where they're for profit. So if that emotion element and that engagement and that personal identification and investment in the organization is not there, you're probably going to have difficulty getting these individuals to really get their heart and soul into your cause. So absolutely, yes, the 8 E's apply in the nonprofit sector as well.
All right, next question is from Anthony in Brazil. Anthony, thanks for joining us. His question is, perhaps too broad a choice for an E, but entrepreneurial outlook and insight of the business you are auditing is important. Hernan, could this be included too?
Entrepreneurial. It's interesting that was brought up because I was kind of toying with that for a little bit as well. And entrepreneur or intrapreneur, because there's another term out there as well. But let's address that. I believe Anthony is the one that brought it up because yes, I believe that is very relevant as well. And here's why this matters. What we're seeing in a lot of organizations is the need to reinvent themselves. So, are we producing, are we creating, are we developing, are we marketing what our customers want? What they were looking for in the 80s may not be what they wanted in the 90s. What they wanted in the 90s may not be what they want today. And our world is changing so rapidly. So people need to think like entrepreneurs, right? New ideas. How can we help the organization come up with new products, services, methodologies, embracing new technologies? We need to think like a business person within the organization and how we can help the organization always keep from that perspective. And of course, the entrepreneur is also going to be very mindful about their revenues and the costs and those dynamics as well. And they're very much invested in the organization too. So entrepreneurship, intrapreneurship, yes, I agree. That's another E that we may want to also consider. So maybe we're close to getting to
close
9.
to number 9. All right, our next question is from Raina. Raina, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. If not, my apologies. Her question is governance not a critical tool to ensuring that the 8 E's are alive and kicking? Is tone at the top not responsible to set the context of the 8 E's? Thanks in advance for your efforts and for ACI platform.
Absolutely. So the way I look at the 8 E's is that they are part of this large pursuit, right? We can fit the 8 E's. And that's one of the reasons why I like this framework so much is because it is versatile enough that you can adapt it to different things. We can adapt it to governance like what the question is all about. And I agree, because in some cases we're talking about things like culture and oversight and structure and leadership and management. And that's definitely a great and very relevant umbrella to be placed above the 8 E's. And then within that, we can then break it down. So this is how I see the 8 E's. It's a way to break down some of these larger topics. I'll give you another example just to elaborate on this further. If you think, governance is part of the GRC framework. Well, if you think about governance, I just spoke about that, risk. We can take risk and embed it into the 8 E's as we look at how each one of these E's could be compromised. Could we fail to achieve these E's and think of it as a risk? And then controls. What are we doing? What mechanisms are in place to make sure that the risks of not achieving the E materialize? So we can think about it from a risk perspective. And of course, compliance. There are elements of compliance. I gave some examples of that when I was speaking about equity, when I was talking about economy, for example, and even fairness. Let's think, for example, of organizations that are going to buy local. So from a compliance perspective, whether it's internal or external, government mandated or self-imposed, they may say, we want to buy X percentage of our inputs locally. So now we can see how GRC, the compliance in GRC, can also be applied to this. And of course, excellence. Compliance and excellence go hand in hand. Now let's take this further and look at the ESG mechanism that is now becoming very commonplace, very much talked about. So environment, we already have one of those. Social, which speaks to emotion and ethics and a few others that I kind of elaborated and embedded in my comments along the way. And then governance, once again. So absolutely, yes, it is very versatile.
All right, and I know that we touched on this during the presentation, but for Bashir writes, could the 8 E's be used as a method to audit a company's corporate culture? Like I said, I know that we touched on this, Dr. Hernan, but maybe we could expand on it a little further.
Yes. So the culture is one of those things that almost permeates the organization, right? So it provides that foundation upon which a lot of the elements of the organization are built and how things are executed. So we can start to look at how culture may fit into this. You can look, for example, at emotion, right? The culture of the organization is that by and large, hopefully universal, hopefully everyone, but at least the vast majority of employees identify with the organization and they're really invested in it. The culture is such. Let's say the excellence element. The people are proud of their work and they're going to make sure that they don't cause a mistake or pass a mistake. They are really focused on doing things right. Excellence is part of the culture. Ethics, we want to make sure we make the right decision. If we don't know the answer, we're going to go find out because we want to make sure that we do what is morally right. So we have some compliance elements that are going to speak to, for example, corruption and bribery and all of that. But from the ethical dimension, they're already they got a head start. They're already thinking about doing the right thing. And yes, FCPA, UK Bribery Act, and bribery and all of these things. Well, yeah, that's important, of course. We're going to make sure we address the compliance elements. But culturally, they're already predisposed to acting ethically. That's a head start. So yes, it can definitely help us support the review and understanding of the organization's culture.
All right, awesome. Let's take one more question. Is the 8Es a framework to be used only at the program level, or can it be adapted to process level or the organizational level too?
Yes. So, the previous question, when I was talking about how we can have, for example, the governance umbrella, and then we can break it down into those 8Es below that, we can also adapt it from the organization's perspective if you think about the organizational hierarchy or tree. So you can apply that at the organizational level. Imagine coming up with a scale. Maybe you have like the capability maturity model, maybe like a 0 to 5 scale. And now you're looking at these elements across the organization. You're saying, okay, corporate-wide, how are we doing with each one of these 8 dimensions? And then we bring it down one level to the program level. And we say, okay, different programs or even functions. Again, some people in the nonprofit sector may look at it as programs. In the for-profit sector may look at it as functions or both. Again, it doesn't matter. We bring it down from the corporate level, organization level, to that program or process level, and we start looking at whether or not these elements are there. So yes, absolutely, we can start to assess different dynamics. Now, to show you how this could apply, imagine having different programs or different processes, because usually a process will go below the programs. So what you could do is then build scales that you can then use and then drill down or move up by looking at those numbers. Which ones are scoring higher, which ones are scoring lower in terms of the expectations, the goal setting, the structures, the support of these different E's, and how well we're doing. When you start to look at those metrics and looking at which ones score lower, you can then start to identify where maybe we can encourage management to take a closer look and help to bring things up a little bit. So absolutely, organizational, program, process level, it also fits into that.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Hernan, for walking us through the 8Es and giving us all that great, valuable information. To our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. For Dr. Hernan Murdock, I'm Kathy Chambers. I hope to see you again soon.